Okay, today I'm going to talk about list 3, which is an interesting list in that it contains mostly gymnosperms rather than the angiosperms or the flowering plants. So these are the cone-bearing plants, the conifers, if you will. And there's just a few angiosperms in here, but by and large, most of these are the primitive, older, and I'm speaking 150 million years old or so, plants that have been around a long, long time. So these are some of the early ferns and conifers that were around at the time of the dinosaurs. So let's take a look at these plants. Okay, the first family we're going to take a look at is the Araucariaceae, or the Araucaria family. And this is a group of plants that are, again, conifers, and many of them are considered to be living fossils. In other words, they may have only had fossil evidence of them, and then they actually found some of the living specimens through exploration. So they're endangered species, basically. So in this group, we have 3 genera that are mostly found in the southern hemisphere. So the Araucaria, which is what we're going to cover, and then the Agathis, and then the Wolemi that we may see out on the grounds. It's kind of a scraggly looking little plant. Not super happy here, but it can grow in this area. So these are very large symmetrical evergreens, and as we walked around campus, we usually point them out on the horizon that you can actually see these things peeking up over. They're very tall plants. The female cones of these are large and woody, to the point where at the Botanic Garden I know they have to cordon off pathways when they're in their fruiting stage, their coning stage, because the cones on these are so large and heavy that they've actually killed people. So not here, but in other areas. So as a safety precaution, they just keep people away from the area. So they're very interesting but dangerous cones. So you wouldn't want to put them in a parking lot or in an area that people are going to be walking by. So it's a little dangerous certain times of the year. So again, in this particular family, we do have things like the bunya, the monkey puzzle tree, but we're going to be covering the Araucaria heterophyllus. Okay, this is interesting. Let me fix this picture that we can't see. Okay, I've got another picture in here. I hope this doesn't happen in the real PowerPoint for you, but I'll go ahead and fix that if so. So the Araucaria heterophylla is actually from an island called Norfolk Island, and it's in the southwestern Pacific Ocean, kind of off in the Australian region there. And it is not a pine, so that's one thing. We'll be covering pines later in the semester, and they'll all be from the genus Pinus. But in the southern hemisphere, that's the closest thing they have to a pine. So, but again, we don't consider it a true pine. It does, however, share some of the same characteristics of the pines in the fact that you can see that it grows in these layers of branches. And so every year it puts out new buds, and you can kind of see them forming at the top here, and they're a little bit more mature here. And so these growth increments indicate then a season's growth for this particular plant. And so if we've had a really good year of rainfall, then the increments would be longer, but if it's been a dry year, perhaps the increments would be shorter. So this actually looks like it was growing in an area that had pretty steady amounts of rainfall, not a lot of variation. But you could see that in a regular Araucaria heterophylla. So the Norfolk Island pine then is very unique. It gets to be extremely tall, about 80 feet or so, and then only about 25 feet wide. Now, it does have these long kind of branchlets that have overlapping scales on them, but they're very soft. They're not pokey at all, typically. Now, the fruits are kind of interesting. They're probably about softball size, so they're probably not going to kill anybody. They're not that dangerous. And then, honestly, they have to be very old and mature before they do begin to form these particular cones. And it's only the female cones that are going to be, more dense. So again, very small evergreen needles, so to speak, very tiny overlapping. And then these plants do well around here. They like regular water and humidity. They can take a mild frost. But again, all over Oceanside, you'll see people growing these. Oftentimes they're purchased maybe as an indoor houseplant or as a kind of a seasonal Christmas tree perhaps. And so you might keep them in a container for a while and then decide to plant it out in your backyard. And again, they get to be real tall and narrow. So they'll take sun or part shade. They'll go down to about 20 degrees Fahrenheit. But again, for most backyards are considered to be a little bit too tall. They get out of bounds pretty easily. Okay. All right. Next we're going to look at the cypress family, the Cupressaceae. And this includes the junipers and the cedars. And these are found all over the world and usually have kind of this reddish bark. And if you've ever had a cedar chest or a cedar lined closet or even used a number 2 pencil, you probably know what cedar smells like. It's very aromatic. So the leaves of these can be scale-like, again kind of the overlapping imbricate scales tight to a branch, or they can be more needle-like or awl-like. So an awl is just another name for a needle. And these seed cones can either be woody or they can be kind of leathery or berry-like and fleshy. So junipers in particular have these fleshy types of cones. So we might call them a berry-like or call them a fruit, whatever, but it really is technically considered a cone because these are conifers. So all over the Italian countryside you might see these Italian cypress, Cupressus sempervirens. And again, sempervirens means evergreen. And so that's a good word to know because we have a couple of plants that have that specific epithet this week. We obviously grow them a lot here in Southern California because our Mediterranean climate is very similar, and a lot of times the topography or the architecture that we use is really very complementary to these Italian cypresses. But beware how you use them. They are definitely like an exclamation point in the landscape. So one by itself might kind of stick out like a sore thumb, but if you actually had them lining a driveway or as maybe a barrier, kind of a living fence, that might make a little bit more sense to you. Again, they are native to Southern Europe and Western Asia. These also can get fairly large, about 60 feet tall, 5 feet wide, so they're very columnar in form. But be careful when you do put them next to your driveway to give them that 5 feet that they're going to need. So set them back from the driveway as much as possible because they will spill over eventually if they get close to it, if you plant them too close. So again, they're considered to be very adaptable. This particular group, the Cupressaceae, are really easy to grow in poor soil and droughty conditions. They take heat, they take cold, so they're a real rough, tough group of plants. They do tolerate regular water, but we do say to avoid fertilizer because they can get a little bit too floppy, so we don't want to grow them really rich type of soil. Okay, the fruit of these is kind of interesting. It's maybe about 1 inch in diameter or so. It's kind of a tan, little soccer ball pattern on there of the cone. And again, these would be the female cones. The foliage is scale-like, and it is very soft, not prickly at all. And they're, these tiny overlapping scales very close to the branchlets there. Full sun, hardy to about 15 degrees Fahrenheit. So again, another one that takes below freezing temperatures. And again, be real careful when you use these. The straight species often gets too tall and too large, and so we like to use some of the different cultivars that are out there you'll find at your nursery, like Stricta, which is more narrow. Glauca is a nice blue form, and then Monshell or Tiny Tower is a really nice compact one that's used quite commonly around here. And here's a view of what the Tiny Tower might look like. Again, it's that same narrow upright habit, but instead of getting 60 feet tall, it only maybe gets about 25 feet tall. So it's an improvement on that. And then only about 3 feet wide instead of 5 feet wide. And you'll see these for sale in nurseries either as sort of the straight skyrocket look, or you may see them pruned up in a topiary so that they get those little spiral looks, which you would have to keep pruning to maintain that look. So in a formal garden, that might be an interesting plant to use. So they're good for containers, or you can actually just plant them in the landscape. They're kind of cute when they're small, but again, they will get large. Okay, next we have in the same family a juniper, and so we've got Juniperus chinensis kaizuka, or sometimes it's called Juniperus chinensis tortuosa, or the Hollywood juniper. Sometimes it's called the contorted juniper. This is how they grow naturally, which is kind of interesting. So this kind of wild, windswept, contorted form is typical for these. So they're very interesting and unusual to use in the landscape. Again, they can get pretty big, about 30 feet tall, 25 feet wide, so they're a large, large shrub, small tree. And again, they've got these very dense scale-like needles. Now, we're not going to be able to tell these apart from a cutting on an ID test without the fruit. So we will put the fruits with this one as well as the one we just saw before that, the Italian cypress. So juniper fruits are pretty unique. They're this bluish color, kind of a berry-like cone, and these plants are considered dioecious. In other words, we have plants that are female or plants that are male, and so they're distinct individuals. It's only the females that are going to have the fruit, or the bluish fruit, I should say. The male cones are probably kind of woody, and they look just, they're not very significant at all. So if you do have the female, I think this Chinensis kaizuka is a female selection, so it's common for it to have the blue fruits, and we always try to include that on the ID test. Now we do have a couple other junipers. They may or may not have fruit, but if they have this very tight, softish, scale-like foliage and blue fruit, then you would conclude it's the kaizuka. Okay, Juniperus chinensis kaizuka. Like all members of this family, or junipers in particular, they're very tolerant of many types of soils. They do like it well drained. So again, they're what we consider pioneer plants. Oftentimes after a fire, if these are native to the area, these seeds will germinate and come in and live in these kind of open, old field kind of conditions. Very salt tolerant. Many of the junipers actually are found at the seashore and areas like that. So we're through the Rocky Mountains, so they're really good for our particular soils. Now, being a chinensis, it's probably not native to the United States. It's more of an Asian variety, but these particular ones do well here. Again, the selection is the contorted form. Hardy to about 10 degrees Fahrenheit, so pretty darn good for these warmer areas. Now, we couldn't grow them back in Ohio because it definitely gets below 0 sometimes, and so that would be a problem, but they're very interesting, kind of that free-form shape. Okay, another juniper that we're covering is more of a ground cover, and you can see it here in a probably a 1 or 2 gallon container. And this is the Juniperus conferta, and the cultivar Blue Pacific is one of the more common ones. Now, this has a totally different branching habit. Instead of being a large upright shrub, this is more of a ground cover. And also it has very long needles on it. So it has the AWL, awl-like foliage on it, not the scale-like foliage. These are native to Japan and from the sandy shores there along the ocean. So not only does it have the sandy, well-drained soil, but it also is salt tolerant. And it does like good drainage. So that's another thing that's kind of common to the Juniperus genus. But a lot of people like this as an evergreen ground cover. So it looks like this all year round. No showy flowers, no showy fruits or cones or anything like that, but really just for its kind of texture as a ground cover. They can get to be about 12 to 18 inches high. And then, that's kind of generous on the 18-inch side. and each one can spread about 5 to 8 feet. So I have a neighbor who just put these in in a new landscape, and he knew what he was doing, so he spaced them out, but after about a year they're actually starting to knit together. So you'll see them used in landscapes as a nice ground cover, and then also maybe spilling over a wall would be a good use for this as well. And then I've seen people that they've just overgrown so much, they put too many together, they've actually had to kind of prune them into like a hedge, and they do seem to tolerate that pruning well too. So a little close-up here of the needles. Again, you can get fruit on them, but we're probably not going to see that on the cuttings that we have. So don't worry about looking for fruit, but look for these very characteristic long needles that are about 1/4 to 3/4 of an inch long, usually about 1/2 inch or so. And they're kind of bluish green. And again, depending on the cultivar that you get, there's one called Blue Pacific, there's another called Emerald Sea. But Blue Pacific is by far, I think, one of the more common ones of this. Okay, so again, they're very adaptable to the salt and drought, but they do not like it wet constantly. So you'll get root rot in heavy clay soils or those that hold a lot of water. Again, full sun like all junipers. This one takes it down to -10 degrees. So we did actually grow this one in Ohio, which is a good clue as to how cold tolerant that is. And again, back in the eastern parts of the United States, it's very common. Okay, a little bit of a problem here with the picture. I'm going to shrink that just a little bit so we can see the word. But this is the Juniperus sabina tamaricifolia, so it's a different species of juniper. And it's important to know the different species. Pretty much from the nursery industry, they will usually be known by their cultivar names because there's lots of common cultivars out there. This one gets the nickname the tam juniper, Tamarix juniper. But you can see it's another kind of a fluffy ground cover type. And the reason we want to know the differences, whether it's a conferta or a sabina or a chinensis, is sometimes nurserymen actually like to graft these together and make maybe one that is what we call a standard. In other words, it looks like a tree, but maybe it's got a tam or a Blue Pacific grafted on the top, and so you get this thing with a tall upright habit that spills over and has this weeping form that comes off of it. So occasionally you'll see some of those, and they have to be closely related in order to be able to graft them together. So anyway, the other reason you might want to know is that some species are more susceptible to different diseases than others. So back east we would have these juniper kind of leaf spot fungal diseases that would be a problem on wet years. And so if you had that problem a lot in the landscape, it really made your junipers look ugly, and you would want to avoid those particular varieties that were susceptible to that. So the sabinas actually are pretty good, tolerant to a lot of diseases. In other words, they're not susceptible. And one other thing about the sabina group in particular is that I think they're really stinky. To me, they smell like cat pee. So when you get a group of these cuttings together, or you pull off a fresh cutting and you smell it, and feel free to do this in the class too. If you're looking at it and you're not quite sure what it is, if it has that real distinctive sharp odor to it, there's a good chance it is the tam juniper. I'll give you some other ideas to take a look at too. But these are native to Europe and Western Asia and the mountainous areas. So again, it's kind of Mediterranean climate there in a lot of those areas, or maybe even a little bit harsher. We could grow these back in Ohio, so they're very cold tolerant. These will get 18 inches high, about 10 to 15 feet in spread. So these are much wider spreading. So what you're looking at here are two individual shrubs that are very compact, kind of mounded in the center and spreading. Again, very adaptable to drought and other climates. Okay, so just to show you a little bit of the leaf difference in these, this is this close-up of the scale-like leaves over here, and then the awl-shaped leaves. Our particular variety we're looking at, the tam juniper, has a lot of these awl, AWL, real spiny kind of leaves. So as you handle this, it's real prickly feeling to you. These would have a much softer feel until you get down in this area, and then you'll find those needles. And again, they've got that sharp savin-like odor. And again, some people can remember that with the, the Sabine women supposedly were smelly. I don't know. I don't know my Greek or Latin history mythology that well, but anyway, the story goes. Again, these can have fruits. They're kind of that bluish berry that may turn a little more blueberry color, kind of a blue-black color. But again, we're not likely to see any of the cones on this. So again, fruit's not really the correct term to use. Cone would be better. But a very low maintenance. Again, full sun. They might take some part shade. And then again, some of the different types are going to be more blight resistant, as I mentioned before. But as a group, these do tend to be resistant. Okay, now going to a totally different type of plant, much different climate that this likes, much different look to it. We're going to take a look at one of the tree ferns in the Cyatheaceae family, or the tree fern family. And these are tropical, but they're not found in North America. These are ancient plants, again appearing in the fossil records, but these are actually ferns that reproduce by spores. This is the type of fern, though, that gets a big trunk on it that actually looks like a tree. So we call them tree ferns, but they really are ferns. And unbranched, they can reach up to 20 meters, which is around 60 feet or so in height. So these do get quite large in rainforests in those areas. Now, Southern California, where we don't have much rainfall or irrigation, they're not going to get that huge that fast, but they do lend a nice tropical look. So here we have the Cyathea cooperi, or cooperi, typical tree fern, again out in front of a business or residence here, giving that sort of tropical look. You can see it looks like a little begonia here, got some asparagus fern, fatsia, the elephant ears, maybe a different species of fern here. So this is all kind of a lush tropical look that you can get with moderate to low water. Okay, here's the new growth of a frond. Most all ferns will do this when the new buds come out. They look like fiddleheads. And these happen to be covered in these blonde hairs. And some people, if you get tangled up with them or get a lot of them on your skin, they can be kind of irritating. So if you have to work around these, do some pruning or whatever, you may want to, wear long sleeves rather than, get these all over yourself. So, Cyathea. Again, cooperi or cooperi, named after Dr. James Cooper, so somebody's last name there. Again, they can get around here, probably 15 to 20 feet high by 10 to 12 feet wide. And again, that's more reasonable for Southern California rather than reaching the enormous heights that you might have in a tropical rainforest type situation. So each individual frond can grow up to 6 feet, and they're fairly fast growing. So in class we'll show you how large those individual leaves are, and if I'm able to get the whole leaf on the ID test, it will take up a whole table. They're huge. So, or one frond, I should say, gets that. Now, as a fern, it will reproduce by spores, and many of these leaves will have copious amounts of spores or rusty look on the underside of the leaf, and so that's very typical, very common. It's not a disease, but they will leave that characteristic dusty spore, which is what they use to reproduce with. So if you want more of them, you would have to germinate them in probably a nice moist propagation house. Okay, another way that we tell the Cyathea cooperi from others is we look at the old trunk, and we can oftentimes see what are referred to as coin spots where the old fronds were attached. And so that helps us pick them out from a distance. So these are fairly adaptable for Southern California, but they do prefer organic soils and moisture as much as possible. Overhead water is preferred. You could put them on a drip system, but they're definitely going to appreciate it when they do get overhead water. So as much humidity and moisture as you can give them without, going crazy in our drought lately here. You'll want to use this to give you that tropical look. So a lot of resorts and other places will use these, or businesses. They do tolerate our low humidity, so they're adaptable again. Alkaline soils don't seem to bother them. The cool temperatures that you get closer to the coast seem to be okay too. Again, these are not going to be frost tolerant by any means. You'll only be using these in the coastal communities here in Southern California. So I don't believe they take any freezing temperature at all. So sun or part shade, and the further inland you go, the more shade they're going to need. Okay, so Brentwood is a popular cultivar that you'll see of this particular plant. Okay, another dinosaur group here that you see quite popularly in Southern California is the cycad family, the Cycadaceae, and these are represented by one plant that we're going to be looking at, the Cycas revoluta. Now there are over 95 species recognized in this particular genus. And oftentimes they'll have the name palm as sort of part of the common name, but these are not true palms. We will cover the true palms the last week, list 11, or the last list that we're going to be looking at. And like some of the other plants that we are covering, this is sort of a more primitive, I guess, type of pattern here. These plants are dioecious. And again, dioecious means that the plants are either going to have all male cones on them or all female cones. Now we can have this also in the angiosperms. So hollies are a broadleaf type of plant that does have, you either have a male holly or a female holly. In other words, it produces all male flowers or all female flowers. So if you think of dioecious as the literal translation means two houses, or as one of my colleagues likes to say, if you think of divorce, where mommy and daddy live in different houses, okay, that's another way to sort of explain this. Okay, in this case the leaves have kind of a single vein, and again, these are found around the time of the dinosaurs, so they're very ancient plants. Now cycads as a group are highly prized and collected. Some people are just like cycad freaks and they love to collect these things, to the point where some of the more rare cycads are actually worth quite a bit of money, and people tend to steal them. So nowadays what a lot of people do is they will put chips in the plant so that if any are stolen, they actually can not track them so much, but if they come across one and it does have a chip in it, they may actually be able to identify it. Some of the cycads come from South Africa, and that's a real big problem there. This particular group that we're looking at, though, the Cycas revoluta, is actually from Japan. And this is the most common one. You'll actually see this, at Home Depot. It's not that rare at all. But the sago palm is the common name, and it is not a palm. Again, these are native to Japan, which is kind of interesting. And again, they're considered a living fossil. There actually is a native cycad that you can find in Florida. And so, cycads are all over the place in sort of these warmer, moist areas typically. This will get 8 to 10 feet tall and about 5 to 6 feet wide. So again, if you get a small one, make sure you give it plenty of room. Like the Norfolk Island pines, these grow in sort of flushes of growth, and so you'll have new growth coming right out of the center of the plant, and you'll get this whorl of leaves that are new. Now, as I mentioned before, we have separate males and females, and so the male cone is sort of this long structure, and the female cone is more of this rounded one. And you can actually see the fruits, the little red fruits in here developing, or the seeds, so to speak, that are developing inside this. And so gymnosperm means naked seed. So instead of being enclosed in a fruit ovary type structure, these have sort of these scales around it, and then these are the fruits that are inside of that. So they're not really enclosed completely in any kind of an ovary type structure. So that kind of puts it in that conifer group, so to speak. So very dark green, stiff leaves. Does resemble a feather palm, but again, it's not a palm. But that's how it got its common name. And these individual leaves or fronds are about 3 to 4 feet long. And again, they're drought tolerant. They'll take regular water, but they will tolerate some drought. So that makes them pretty useful here in Southern California. Again, it'll give you that tropical look. They'll take sun to shade. They're fairly hardy. Japan does get quite cold. I'm not sure exactly how far they'll take it, but I do believe they will take it at least down in the 30s. But again, don't plant them too close to the walkway. The stiff leaves are kind of spiny, and you don't want those. You don't want to have to prune one side of the plant or have people getting snagged by them as they walk by. Okay, our next group of plants are going to be in a family known as the Ericaceae family or the heath family. And this includes a lot of acid-loving plants. In other words, they like acidic soils rather than alkaline soils. So it's really difficult to actually grow a lot of these in this area because of that, because we tend to have more alkaline soils and the type of soils that these plants really just don't like. They're too heavy, not well drained enough. And again, they're, as a group, typically considered to be lime hating. So what we are looking for here are some that might actually be able to hang out in our little more alkaline soils. And so we can actually grow some of these here fairly easily. So we're looking for some of the more tolerant ones. Leaves of these in this group are alternate and simple, and they can either be entire or they might have serrated edges. The flowers are typically pendant, and a lot of times if you know what lily of the valley looks like, it's kind of that look to them. And usually there's some pollen in them, but the pollinators kind of work on these and then kind of shake it out. It occurs usually in clumps inside the flower, so it's kind of interesting. Pollinator, usually bees and things that can get in there and get at the pollen or what's important for this plant. Now, a lot of our commercially available products like cranberries, blueberries, huckleberries are in this group, as well as heaths, heathers, azaleas, and rhododendrons. And azaleas and rhododendrons in particular are difficult to grow in this area, but there are a few of them that actually will hang in there. And in our spring class, we actually do cover the azalea plant. Okay, so we'll take a look at our Arbutus unido, the strawberry tree. And we like to say for that species name, unido, you need only one, or I eat only one, because even though they do have a kind of attractive red fruit on it that looks like it might be good to eat, they really aren't that tasty. They're like, ugh, you know, kind of mealy tasting. But it does have the common name strawberry tree, but again, it's not a true strawberry at all. These are actually native to southern Europe and Ireland. Where these are found, they're about 15 to 25 feet tall. We have a nice huge specimen on our hillside. It grows really well there. Leaves are evergreen, and then they do have a red petiole on the leaf, and then again, these very attractive fruits and also very attractive flowers. So the next slide will show that. So again, these sort of urn-shaped, bell-shaped, lily of the valley kind of type flowers here in white. They're kind of greenish white here as they're sort of new. And then this is the fruit that's forming. It'll start out kind of yellowish, and then as they ripen, they'll get more red colored. So the fruit is about 3/4 inches in diameter or so, and they turn yellow-red in the fall, but sometimes you can have fruit and flowers on at the same time. Full sun or part shade. The more you use it, perhaps in desert situations, you want to give it more shade, but they will go anywhere from the desert to the sea here in San Diego County. They need good drainage and regular pruning, and I would say the good drainage is important for all members of this family. The reason they like the acidic soils is that it helps keep out certain fungal diseases that get into the root systems and cause problems down there. So the more aeration that you have, the less likely you are going to have those diseases. So that's the importance of good drainage there, just really to help fight off diseases in particular. These will take it down to about 10 to 15 degrees. So again, they'll go below freezing, but not below zero. Okay, so they do come from areas where it does get quite cold and snows and all that. They're beautiful specimen trees. You can use them as screens or lawn. They have kind of a nice red-brown shedding bark or shredding bark. And they can become quite picturesque as the limbs kind of twist around with age. There are some compact cultivars that can get up to about 8 feet. So if you don't like that huge look to it, you can look for a cultivar. Now, another plant that we use quite a bit is one called Marina. I guess I don't have a picture of it, but Arbutus marina is a beautiful hybrid. They think it's a cross between the Arbutus unido and then the California native Arbutus. And if you know anything about our native Arbutus, it has a beautiful kind of cinnamon colored bark to it. And so Arbutus marina has a much more attractive bark, and it's just a little more available. It's a beautiful small flowering tree if you can get a hold of that. And again, there's other cultivars you can get too. There's a desert one that's available. So there are some native ones that are actually working out pretty decently as landscape plants here. So you can get some dwarf ones, some regular size ones, and they're kind of on the expensive side, but Arbutus marina is a wonderfully beautiful tree, and it's actually a little more ornamental than the Arbutus unido because of its beautiful cinnamon colored bark, where unido's bark is not that attractive. Okay, Arctostaphylos, or the manzanita, is another plant that's in this particular family, and oftentimes we get the Arbutus and the manzanita mixed up, but instead of having a strawberry-like fruit, the manzanita means little apple, and so these have a little harder type of fruit on them and very tiny. Okay, again, manzanitas are native here to California and the Pacific Northwest. We actually had one back in Michigan that grew as a ground cover. The little bearberry was a type of Arctostaphylos. So there's many species of that around. Now, when you see the SPP, that just means it stands for many species. We're not really covering any one in particular. But if you just have one on a test, you would just go with the Arctostaphylos SP. Okay, so SPP means we're talking about more than one, but if you see just one on a test, then you would just put SP. So I know that's kind of confusing, and we won't take off points, or shouldn't take off points for that. So watch it in case one of us does. Okay, so again, evergreen leaves. They're simple, elliptical. They're not going to be toothed like you'll find on the Arbutus. But let's take a look at it. And again, you can see beautiful cinnamon colored kind of peeling bark. Flowers very similar to the Arbutus, little urn-shaped bell-like flowers, and again they dangle downwards, again kind of like lily of the valley but a little different. And then the fruits that are left behind are these so-called little apples. Here they are in the green stage, but they will turn either orange or red as they ripen. Again, notice the leaves are entire, so they're very simple leaves. They're not at all toothed like the Arbutus was. Okay, again, they like well-drained soil. Talked about that. And little water in the summer. Again, they're California natives. We don't get a lot of water in the summertime, and so we don't want to do that. And you can overwater and kill these things, so you need to be real careful with that. Sun to part shade. Some of them will take it down to 15 degrees. There's a lot of cultivars out there. You can get some as a ground cover, so if you look for the one Emerald Carpet, Howard McMinn gets to about 3 feet, and then Dr. Hurd gets to about 10 feet. So if you go to a native plant nursery or a native plant garden, you'll probably see all of these types being used. So they're excellent for the landscape as long as you've got the right conditions of well-drained soil for these California natives. Okay, another native that we're going to take a look at is in the oak or the beech family called the Fagaceae. And this has about 900 species of trees and shrubs. And if you're from back east at all or Northern California, you may be familiar with sort of deciduous oak trees or maybe even beech trees. We're really just going to look at one particular oak, the Quercus agrifolia, but actually Quercus suber or the cork oak grows well in this area as well. It's from the Mediterranean. And so the cork oak is actually, you can harvest the bark of it, and that's where we actually get cork from. So all oaks have acorns as their fruit. But in this particular group, we also have beeches and chestnuts. So again, those are also prized for their fruit, especially by wildlife, squirrels and deer and other that eat these chestnuts or beech nuts, as they're called. And most of these make excellent wood. Wine barrels are made out of oak in particular. A lot of furniture, flooring can be made out of the oak or the beech as well. Especially the oak is very handy for that. So sometimes they're harvested and grown agriculturally as a forestry product. Okay, so the one we're going to be looking at is the Quercus agrifolia, which is called the coast live oak. And this is a native plant, native tree to this area. Now, it's not the only oak in this area. We have several of them, but this is the very large oak that you see, if you drive from this area back in through Escondido and Valley Center and some of those areas. They've got these beautiful oak trees that grow. Now, actually, Encinitas, the name means little oaks, so there actually is a little kind of scrub oak that is native closer here to the coast. But this is the more large kind of shade tree type of oak. So live oak just means basically that it's an evergreen oak. It doesn't lose its leaves. Many of the oaks back east turn a beautiful kind of reddish maroon color, and then they drop their foliage in the fall. So these are just beautiful, wide-spreading trees, so 70 feet tall, 80 feet wide, so they're usually much wider than they are tall. If you do get a chance to see them in fruit, this is the acorn. It's very long and slender. The leaves can be anywhere from 1 to 3 inches long. They look kind of like holly leaves. They're spiny, and they are usually cupped. So we usually point that out in lab when we look at them. If you kind of turn them upside down, you can float them like a boat, so to speak. So that's kind of characteristic of the Quercus agrifolia. And they're very drought tolerant. Again, you should not water them in the summertime because, again, that area that they're adapted to does not get summer rainfall typically. If you do grow these, we like to say that you should not disturb the root system. Leave the leaf litter. These will shed their leaves briefly right before the new leaves come out in the spring, and so you want to leave them just to collect underneath there. So don't be neat and tidy with these, and also don't try to grow things under the tree, or you'll be disappointed. So you don't want to do any cultivation at all under these and just kind of let it go natural. So it's great for large properties. Okay, next up is the ginkgo family, Ginkgoaceae, and this is actually kind of a interesting family. It only has one species in it. So the ginkgo biloba is actually an only child, so to speak. So again, we consider this a living fossil. These are extremely old, again, 150 million years old or so, back from the time of the dinosaurs. And also fossil record shows that this was actually native to North America. And so in the petrified forests and other areas, we can find some fossilized logs of these as well as fossilized leaves. So it's a very unique fan-shaped leaf. And again, this is actually considered a conifer. And so the seeds actually have this fleshy outer coat. So it's almost like a broadleaf angiosperm. But again, apparently there's the way it's formed or whatever, it's not from an ovary. So it's different. It's still considered a conifer, or in the gymnosperm group. So let's take a look at it. Here's a picture of the tree in fall color. And so ginkgo biloba, sometimes called the silver apricot. It gets the biloba when we take a look at the foliage, you'll see that. Another name for it is maidenhair tree because the leaves look a lot like the maidenhair fern frond. So these are actually native to China and grown here, been here for a long, long time. But huge trees, 70 to 80 feet, 35 to 40 feet wide, so they can get to be quite large at maturity. Now, the flowers are insignificant, also dioecious, and we usually recommend that you select the males only unless you want the fruit. The fruit of the female is highly prized and edible, but it does have sort of a nauseating, vomity kind of smell to it that if you have a huge tree full of fruit, it can be quite overwhelming at the time of year when they're actually fruiting. But beautiful yellow fall color, usually a very clear yellow. I haven't seen that in our specimens or those close to the coast because we tend to not have enough water probably for these plants to grow, and they do tend to get a little bit singed looking before the end of the year. But in other parts of North America, back east in Ohio, we could grow these, so they're very cold tolerant. They would have the most beautiful yellow fall color, and we'd kind of compare a lot of plants that said they had yellow color, but we'd say, yeah, but is it ginkgo yellow? Because ginkgo just had that beautiful clear yellow. The other interesting thing about the foliage in the fall, it is deciduous, and will oftentimes fall at about the same time. So in other words, when these things decided to drop their leaves, probably within about 24 to 48 hours, they'd all be down. So if you were in the leaf collecting business, which is real important back in those areas where we have a lot of deciduous leaves, you do spend quite a bit of your fall raking leaves or picking up leaves if you're a landscaper with vacuums and stuff. These are nice in the fact that they don't do it over a period of weeks, but usually over a period of days. So they're great distinctive plants. So here's a look at the foliage. It's again very distinctive, fan shaped. Now these aren't showing the notch, they don't all, but every once in a while you'll see some of these that do have a little notch in the center of this fan. Again, the females from the landscape perspective are considered messy, and the fruit is very smelly, again smelling like vomit. But you will find these for sale in Asian grocery stores. You can either get them canned or dried, and they're also considered to be really good now medicinally. So you can get extracts or pills that have ginkgo biloba in them. It's supposed to be really good for circulation, for memory, that sort of thing. I've heard or read some recent studies where maybe it's not exactly as it's cracked up to be, but hey, it's worth a shot. If you're having trouble memorizing plant names or forgetful or whatever, the ginkgo biloba might be an interesting thing to try out. I don't think it will hurt you at all, but proceed with caution. Any kind of medicine. But again, these plants were around at the time of the dinosaur. They are extremely tolerant of all kinds of things that have happened over the years. Again, we sort of say like the cockroaches, they keep going. So they're very tolerant of a lot of soils. They prefer it deep, loose, well drained. They don't like water with high salt content. Ours is kind of like that. And so I think that's why the leaves tend to get a little bit singed. But if you have good high quality water, probably not going to be good on reclaimed water. These would be an ideal plant. Again, they're tolerant of pollution, heat, different types of pH. There's really no insect or disease problems to speak of on these. And again, they do have some medicinal value. So interesting plant, great specimen. But again, give them room, they get quite large. Okay, Magnolia family is a angiosperm. So not a gymnosperm, but an angiosperm. But this is considered to be one of the more primitive ones. The flower parts are in rings, and their stamens and pistils are in spirals on a conical receptacle. So again, that's considered to be very primitive for angiosperms, and is actually somewhat reminiscent of the conifer group. So the inflorescence or the flower is a solitary flower with indistinguishable petals and sepals, and so we call them tepals. In other words, we can't really tell the difference between the sepal and the petal, supposedly. Most of these originate in temperate Asia, but they're very economically important as an ornamental. Now, we'll take a look at Magnolia grandiflora, which is a native to the southeastern United States. So if you think of Gone with the Wind and the mansions, down there in South Carolina or whatever. The southern magnolia was a plant that was featured prominently, that as long as the eastern live oaks there too were very prominent on these old plantation areas that are quite gorgeous in these large properties. But these are dense foliage. They're evergreen. However, the leaves do drop. So in other words, leaves will shed, the older ones, maybe when they're about 3 to 5 years old, but the outer ones will stay on the plant. So it never completely loses its leaves, but it does drop them. So be aware of the leaf litter on this. I had a neighbor one time that was, I don't know, but I'm sure there's a word for it, but anyway, he's was very particular about keeping everything neat. And our other neighbor right next to us owned the tree, and it kept going on this other guy's driveway, and he would get so perturbed that, he'd drive home over these crunchy leaves. And so the other neighbor was always really like super cautious. I better get out there and rake up those magnolia leaves before Steve comes home and gets all upset, so that was causing these neighborly disputes. So I would recommend, if you're going to grow these, do it in the middle of a lawn or in a park area. They are used a lot now as street trees in some of our newer developments around here because they are tolerant. They're actually quite lovely here in this particular environment, and so you will see them used a lot, but there is a little bit of a leaf litter that does have to be picked up. So if somebody's neat and tidy, that maybe won't be their favorite plant, and I would not put them over a swimming pool because that would be a problem as well. So they are a beautiful flowering plant, though. I'll show you a close-up of the flowers here next. 40 feet tall, 30 feet wide. Again, smaller here in Southern California, much larger in the southeastern United States. So we consider them to have a moderate growth rate. So the beautiful iconic magnolia flower here that you see, very common in kind of decorative motif. If you go to, say a Cracker Barrel restaurant or anything that's got sort of that southern theme going on, you'll see a lot of this in, patterns, floral patterns and fabrics. You'll see garlands of this. In fact, if you ever get a chance to go to some of the fancier mansions like the Biltmore and other places back east at Christmas time, they actually bring these leaves in the branches, and they make garlands to put around the fireplaces and that sort of thing. So they're beautiful. You can use them as a cut foliage as well. The flowers don't last that long, though. They're beautiful, a little bit fragrant, and they can actually get to be quite large, maybe up to about 10 inches. So we say these can be dinner plate size depending on the variety or the cultivar. Also notice the fruit that's left behind is this cone-like structure, and what you're seeing there is the brown cone with some of the red fruits coming out of it. So it's very attractive with that. And again, the nice glossy evergreen leaves that look a lot like that rusty leaf fig. In fact, sometimes the undersides of the leaves have that rusty appearance with them as well. Likes regular watering, but again, it is drought tolerant once it's established. And again, the constant leaf drop can be a problem for some people. Okay, one of the cultivars that's being used quite a bit around here is one called Little Gem. This is very slow growing, maybe only gets to be about 20 to 25 feet high, 10 to 15 feet wide, and again can branch down to the ground. And so some of these have more kind of rust on the underside than others, but they're a nice evergreen tree for a smaller property. And so again, they're used quite a bit around here. But again, beautiful flowers throughout the summer typically, though sporadically throughout the year around here. Okay, this is a plant that's getting harder and harder for us to find as a specimen, but is one that you will see and is on some of the ID lists that you need to study for if you're going to get certified or take licensing tests in other areas. And this is not a very important family. It's just the Melastomatosae family. It just happens to be the family that this particular plant, the Tibucina erviliana, is in. And this is called the princess flower more commonly. And it's native to South America. It's very fast growing, tropical looking. In fact, you'll see this escaped and growing all over Hawaii. Very adaptable, regular water, well-drained soil, likes to have cool roots, but it has these beautiful kind of purplish flowers, new growth on it. It's kind of this reddish color, and these kind of fuzzy evergreen leaves. Here's another close-up of the flower, quite iridescent purple on a shrub, and so it's got these velvety leaves, you know, lots of little hairs on them, and kind of an orange bronze, new growth, and a little edge to the leaf is also that way, and then these beautiful purplish flowers. And they'll bloom in cycles from late spring to fall. They'll bloom in the shade, they'll bloom in the sun. They'll take it down to the low 20s, and you know, you want to keep them pruned and fed after they go through their blooming cycle. So they're used a lot in containers or perhaps just in your shrub areas. And again, they're beautiful when they're in bloom. Unfortunately, some of ours just don't hang in there in our nursery, so we'll try to get specimens for you of the fuzzy leaves. Okay, another family we're looking at is the podocarp family, getting back to the gymnosperms. These are mostly found in the southern hemisphere. Again, they're considered conifers. The female cone is modified into a fleshy, kind of droop-like structure. So they don't have a woody cone, so to speak. We always kind of think of cones as being woody. But they are in that group. And we do have a couple of them we'll be looking at. The Podocarpus gracilior, which is also known as Afrocarpus gracilior. So you may see different names used. I believe Western Garden Book is still using Podocarpus, but other lists you'll need to learn this as the Afrocarpus gracilior, which is the name that is, I think, more correct for this. We call it fern pine, but it's not a fern and it's not a pine, so sorry about that. That's just the common name, and this is native to East Africa and the mountainous areas. Very popular here as a street tree. It gets to be very large and dense growing, and I think that sort of dense regular habit with not a lot of leaf litter, not a lot of fruits being formed is what makes this somewhat attractive. And so we'll see this used and out in the street tree kind of plantings and then other areas. So it's a nice just kind of a green, evergreen shade tree. The leaves on this are about 2 to 4 inches long and slender. The new leaves are kind of a light green. It's considered to be fine textured, especially when you compare it to the other Podocarpus macrophyllus. And these are dioecious, again, separate male, separate female plants, and they have these fruit-like cones. They do tolerate poor soil, wind, and pollution, down to 15 degrees, and again, that's what's going to make them great as a street tree specimen. In other words, if they can take that pollution and the wind and the horrible soil that you oftentimes get in those situations. So they're very tough for that, and again, very dense, evergreen. You can also prune them up like a hedge. I've got one neighbor that's using them as sort of surrounding one side of his property on a corner, and using that as a screen to kind of screen off the street. And so they can grow very upright, especially if you get them seed grown. If you take cuttings, they tend to be more wide-spreading and droopy. So kind of interesting the way they propagate. Okay, the next one is the Podocarpus macrophyllus, and of course macrophyllus means big leaf. This is called the yew pine. It's not a yew and it's not a pine. This is actually more native to Asia or Japan and is more of an upright, kind of narrow shrub, about 20 to 25 feet tall. And as you can see, the leaves on this are much more stiff and same shape as the other Podocarpus, but different. And these are, again, evergreen, kind of like a needle, but very large and wide. Now, there is another species of this, Podocarpus henkeli, very similar to this, and actually the henkeli is probably a little bit more common locally, but macrophyllus is the one that's showing up on some of the lists. Okay, so the cone is more fruit-like, and you can see it's kind of got this seed on top of a fleshy arrow. We've got sort of this navy blue on the bottom and sort of a light blue on the top where the seed is found, which is kind of interesting. Very unique fruit. You don't have any other plant like that, and I do have some fruits that will probably be on the test for this. Sun to shade, hardy to the mid-teens. Again, use it as a screen or a hedge. One of my neighbors uses this as a screen to screen off the front part of their property. It's probably a little bit more common in Northern California, but you will find it used here as well. Okay, second to the last group here, we've got a group of ferns in the Polypoidaceae. This is just one of the many fern families. We saw the tree ferns, and these are more of the shrubby ferns here. Very diverse. Usually they have underground rhizomes or stems, and so if we cut them all back, they'll resprout from the ground. Now, these do reproduce from spores, and we'll show you what some of those look like. And they're typically found in more wet climates, more shady areas. But we do have some native ferns and other ferns that will grow well in this area. One of the nice ferns that we can grow here is one called the mother fern. This is one from tropical Asia, Australia, and New Zealand. It's the Asplenium bulbiferum. And I'm not sure exactly where the bulbiferum comes from, but the mother fern is definitely a great common name for this, because at the ends or tips of the branches, you can just see them barely here, you will see little baby fernlets that are reproduced on the tips of the branches, and so the mother fern has all these little baby ferns along the fronds. These can get to be quite large and spreading, so we say about 3 feet high, 3 feet wide, and they're great for a shady, moist area. The foliage is very finely dissected, and again you can see these little baby plantlets that are formed at the edges of the leaves, very unique, and sometimes they'll form down the middle, but oftentimes you'll see them at the edges here. Again, they like it moist, more regular water, and a little bit more in the shade to part shade area. So this is one great for a moist, shady area. And occasionally those pop up in the landscape, areas where the water drains to. So it makes perfect sense to be able to have a plant for that. We don't have to always have 100%, cactus succulents, drought tolerant. If you've got that area that's wet and shady, this is a perfect plant for that. And again, also if you want to have a plant that gives you a little bit more tropical look, this one would be great for that as well. And it works well in containers. Another fern in the same family is the Nephrolepis cordifolia. This is called the southern sword fern. And Nephrolepis has to do with nephrology or kidneys. And if you do look at the shape of the the spore sac on this, on the underside of the leaf, they do actually look kind of kidney shaped, which is interesting. The southern sword fern has these really long linear leaves that look like a sword, I guess, to someone. They're native to many tropical regions of the world. They grow like a ground cover here. They're very fast growing, spreading, and they can actually become a weed if you're not careful. So you do need to use some sort of barrier. And if you plant these, just beware, they could take over the whole deal. You can also grow them in containers, but if they don't have any boundaries, they'll go crazy. Okay, sun to shade, which is nice, but they definitely are shade tolerant. And again, you can see these little spore sacs on the underside in a regular pattern on some of the spore-bearing leaves or fronds, and they do look a little kidney shaped there. So they're tough as a ground cover, very low maintenance. You can cut them and use them in flower arranging, so that's kind of nice. But they will escape and become weedy or invasive in a small garden. So make sure you've got a lot of real estate to let these guys go. The Rumora adiantiformis is known as the leather fern or leather leaf. Sometimes we also call this baker fern. This is probably the most common fern that you'll see grown to be used in floral arrangements. If you start taking a floral design class, this is like the first kind of green that you're going to work with or learn about, and we use that oftentimes just to cover the foam or the mechanics. It just makes a great, nice, glossy, evergreen, sturdy fern that you can use to help hide the foam that maybe you're doing your flower arrangement in, the tape and all that stuff, and it just is great in bouquets as well. So these are native to the tropics in the southern hemisphere, but they grow perfectly well out here in our frost-free climate. We want to give them a little bit of shade. And again, like all ferns, these do have spores on the underside of some of the fronds. So you could see that the top of the leaf here was a dark green. The underside of it is kind of a yellowish green. And then when you see these round bullseye things on the back, don't get alarmed. That's just the spore sac. So don't worry about that. Moist soils are, again, good for this. Shade to part shade. This will actually take it to 20 degrees or so. So again, if you're wanting to grow these commercially, you'd probably want to grow them in put a shade structure overhead maybe. Keep it moist and a little bit on the cool side, and these will be great, and you'll have lots of leather leaf to use for your cut flower arrangements, or you can use them in any kind of decorating. They're very long-lived in a container or a vase as well. Okay, so great filler type of foliage. Okay, our next group of plants is the Taxodiaceae, or the bald cypress family as it's called. This is another group of cone-bearing plants or conifers, but the plants in this particular group drop their foliage, and so they are deciduous for the most part. There are some that are evergreen, but they can also include these so-called bald ones that go deciduous. So we have the sequoia dendron and the sequoia, some of the world's largest trees that are native here in California. Now these trees are monoecious, which means they might have separate male and female flowers, or cones, so to speak, not flowers, but they will be on the same tree. So we might have a male cone and a female cone, but they'll be on the same house, so one house monoecious. Leaves can either be spirally arranged or opposite, and I'll show you what that means. And again, it has both evergreen and deciduous. So the sequoia, sequoia dendron are evergreen, and then the bald cypress and the dawn redwood are going to be the deciduous ones. Again, these go back to the time of the dinosaurs again, and sometimes we're actually, some taxonomists are putting these in the same group as the Cupressaceae. So right now we've got them split out as Taxodiaceae, but again, some botanists are thinking maybe they're in the same group as the Cupressaceae, so not too important. Okay, the dawn redwood is a beautiful plant. Again, it's considered to be one of these living fossils. Metasequoia glyptostroboides. Okay, so it's sort of like a sequoia, and then glypto means to carve, and strobus means cone, and so the cones apparently have some sort of little embellishment on them that maybe looks carved. It's, again, I've not even really seen the cones of these very much. But the dawn redwood is native to China, and it's considered a living fossil because it was thought to actually be extinct, and all they had was fossil evidence until it was discovered again, or rediscovered in 1947, that there were some of these, that actually some populations that still were in existence in China. So they found a forest of these, they brought the fruits and seeds back to the United States, and then began to grow this and distribute it throughout all the botanic gardens and nurseries. So it's not super popular down here in Southern California to grow this, but Northern California, back throughout the Midwest, it's a very cold hardy plant. You can grow it in Boston, or you can grow it in Ohio, where I was from, and it works really well. Now this is another one that they do have fossil evidence that this was actually native at one point to the United States, so probably way back again when we had dinosaurs roaming around. It was a lot more different type of climate, more humid and moist. This plant was actually here, but now that it's kind of dry down in Southern California, I'm not sure it was ever native down here, but it's not the happiest here, though you will find some at the Botanic Garden, and they do grow pretty well. These can get to be quite large, to about 50 feet and about 25 feet wide, but again, we've only had them since the 1940s here growing, so it's a little bit unclear exactly how huge these are going to get. Okay, so this was the fall color right before they drop their leaves in the fall, and then this is what they look like the rest of the year. So again, very adaptable, but they would prefer regular water during the growing season. But when they're dormant, they really don't need a lot of water. So it's kind of not exactly the best for the Mediterranean climate, but they do hang in here as well. So the new foliage is bright yellow-green when it comes out in the spring, and then it's going to turn yellowish brown before it drops in the fall. So they have small little brown cones that are similar to the redwood trees. And speaking of redwood, we're covering the coast redwood, again because it is a native plant here in northern coastal California and southern Oregon, and it is going to show up in some of your CLCA or other types of tests that you might have to take. You need to know this particular plant for it. But it is considered the world's tallest tree, about 370 feet in height. And if you've ever been to the redwood forests around, Northern California, up around San Francisco or so, they begin to start there along the coast. They're amazing to go there and see if you get a chance. You definitely want to take a look at these. Narrow conical shaped plants. Again, very tall, not quite as wide as they get tall for sure. And they would prefer regular water and humidity. Then they dislike water high in salts. So again, the ones that we'll look at on campus are not happy campers. They really are not fond of this area. Here's what the fruit looks like. It's always amazing to me that such a tiny seed and fruit is going to produce the world's tallest tree, but it does, definitely. The needles on these are considered to be evergreen and two-ranked. So in other words, along this large kind of rachis here in the center, you've got needles coming off in two directions. So they are ranked like that. Also note the underside of it is this sort of bluish green color, and those are actually the stomatal bands where the stomata are on this particular leaf. So we've got a new cone coming out, and then we have the older previous season's cone that has matured and dropped some seeds probably out of that when it opens up. So they'll take full sun to part sun. They're hardy to about 10 degrees, and again, we would consider these to be too large for most landscapes. Takes too much water, and we really don't recommend these for Southern California. But again, you will find them. Okay, Taxodium disticum, the bald cypress, native actually to the southeastern United States. You do see them grown here. I was driving out around Fallbrook and saw somebody who's got a bunch of these in their landscape. So they are grown here. They actually come from the swampy areas of Florida and Georgia. Again, great for dinosaur gardens if you're doing that for kids or whatever. They'll get to be huge, about 50 to 70 feet in height, about 20 to 30 feet wide, and they're a very large deciduous conifer. Kind of feathery, spirally arranged needles, and again they turn this sort of brownish fall color before the needles drop. If you do grow these in the landscape, it's sort of like the Norfolk Island pine. You can pick these out in the horizon or in the towering above all the other trees in the landscape sometime, and they do have a very distinctive profile. The little cones that they get before they mature, and then the needles of these are much shorter than the dawn redwood, and they are not so much two-ranked, but they are more spirally arranged. So we'll be able to tell the difference between these two, but it is kind of a subtle difference. Again, as I mentioned, they do grow in swampy areas, and if there is a high water table, in order for the roots to breathe, they think that they do send up these knees. So you don't typically find this in areas that are super dry, but bald cypress knees are real common throughout the swamps and those kind of areas. And even if you grow this maybe next to a lake or a large body of water, would be happy there, you may see the knees beginning to form as well. Take sun or shade, cold tolerant. Again, we could grow these in Ohio down to -25 below zero. So definitely very cold tolerant and deciduous with a kind of shaggy cinnamon type bark. Now just to kind of compare and contrast the metasequoia and the taxodium, notice that the dawn redwood has much larger leaves. So I'll try to maybe put these close to each other on the test so you can kind of take a look at them. They're a lot more feathery on the taxodium, a lot thinner, a lot smaller. They're more pointed, whereas they tend to be a little more blunt or rounded. Also, they do have these opposite little buds you can find sometimes on the dawn redwood, whereas they're more alternating. And again, they can be spirally arranged on the bald cypress or the taxodium. Okay. Now, if we were to see these plants in nature, you know, get to see the whole plant, the dawn redwood branches typically go at about a 45-degree angle, and there's this little armpit depression underneath it. Again, that's the metasequoia. And the taxodium tends to be more of a 90-degree angle branch, typically. And again, that's just one way. And again, the armpit's not as, you know, kind of sunken or distinctive there. So both of them do have, you know, kind of similar bark and trunk. They're very kind of spongy. If you go up and pat them, it feels like you're patting a horse sometimes, but a little more scaly type of bark on the Taxodium disticum. Okay, that's it for list 3. So hopefully this has helped you kind of keep all of the plants in here straight and given you a few more hints on the distinguishing characteristics of these plants.